And the reading is from Luke's Gospel, chapter 10, beginning at verse 38. As they went on their way, Jesus entered a village, and a woman named Martha received him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she went to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Tell her then to help me." But the Lord answered her, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things. One thing is needful. Mary has chosen the good portion, which shall not be taken away from her." This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to Jesus. I can't count how many times I've preached this passage and how many times I've got it wrong. So any kind of retelling of this or re-preaching of this passage really has to begin with what it's not about in order to explain what it is about. What it's not about. So first of all, it's not about what is more important. Times of prayer, being with Jesus at his feet, or acts of service. Jesus is not belittling here what Martha was doing. In fact, she was actually being faithful to Old Testament teaching and Old Testament examples. She was being hospitable to her guests, and it's a big thing in the Middle East even today. She was like Abraham, who in Genesis 18, we're told, welcomed three visitors, three strangers into his house, and then ordered that the very best of his flock be slaughtered and killed in order to provide the meal for them. Nothing was too much to give to any guest. And it's exactly the same here. Martha was being a good host. She wanted to give the very best to Jesus. She was getting a bit flustered because obviously there's a lot to do, but her motivation was perfect. You give the very best to those who visit him, and particularly if it's Jesus. But at the same time, Jesus was not elevating Mary and saying that prayer was more important than service. Because our approach, you see, should not be either or, but always both and. We're called to pray and we're called to serve. Some of the most prayerful people in Christian history have been people of service. One example is George Muller of Bristol. He would get up at 5 o'clock every morning and spend at least 2 hours in prayer before the day got started. And he would pray whenever there was need in the day. He would pray when the food ran out or when it ran low. And he would pray until it arrived. And that sometimes take several hours. And often, and well always, it did miraculously. However, in his lifetime, he cared for 10,000 orphans. He established Ashley Down orphan houses all over Bristol, and also during his lifetime provided education for some 120,000 children who would not otherwise have had it. And so his life exemplifies the fact that both prayer and service to his Lord can and should go together. So there's no kind of, one against the other. And the second thing to say about this is that Jesus is not identifying two different types of Christians. One is the worker, represented by Martha, and the other is the contemplative, represented by Mary. The worker leaving the praying to the contemplative, and the contemplating leaving the service to the worker. They're different types, and we're going to complement each other. That's the kind of understanding. The Bible knows nothing of a Christian worker who does not pray or a Christian prayer who does not work. So we mustn't set these two things again as saying it's different personality types, different gifts, whatever. Irrespective of personal preferences, individual personalities, or personality types, which is a big thing in these days, Christians are all expected to both pray and work. In Luke 11, Jesus says, when you pray, and he says, say the Lord's Prayer. His expectation is that they will, when you pray. On the other hand, he also said, whoever wants to be great among you must be your servant. For the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. We must not use the excuse that we are not good at praying or we're not good at serving in order to get out of one or the other. We're expected to do both. So if the passage is not teaching, which is more important, prayer or service, and it's not teaching that there are different types of Christians, some with a greater aptitude for prayer or some for a greater aptitude for service, then what is this passage about? What I first think is that at that particular moment, perhaps because Jesus was merely passing through rather than staying, at that moment the priority was to spend time with him. He wouldn't be there long, and so time was precious, and so he says, in effect, spend time with me. He has something important to say or teach, and they would not have the opportunity again. And so for that time, it was to spend with him. And there's this wonderful play on words that underline what Jesus said to Martha. He says, Martha, Martha, you're worried about, troubled about many things, on the one hand, but one thing is needed. And that one thing at that time was to be with him. So he's contrasting the many small things with the one great important thing, which he calls the good portion or the good part. And this good portion, unlike the smaller and less important portions of food, for example, at that time, would be the one that lasts and will not be taken away. Now is the time to spend with me. And there will come times in your walk and mine where we do have to, because of circumstances, set aside the lesser things in order to do the greater. To set aside even food sometimes. That's what fasting is about. I mean, there's a film I called something to do with the Raven. It's about a king in the 15th century who fought against the Ottoman Empire. And in order to support him, the Pope introduced something called the noon bell. And whenever the noon bell rang, then everybody was to stop what they're doing and to pray for the success of this man against the Ottomans. And he did. He held them back. He fought them back. So there are times when everything else has to stop and we have to spend time in prayer. And secondly, it points to the need to spend time listening to God at some time in the day in order to feed the soul. Just as we order times to eat every day, breakfast, lunch, evening meal, sometimes supper on top of it. I wish I had the capacity. I haven't any longer. So we need to give priority to the food that lasts, and that is the teaching of Christ. That is the food that lasts. And so our passage is not so much only about a contrast between service and prayer, but it's a comparison, if you like, between the need to eat food and the need to eat the word. The need to eat food, the need to eat the word. You know, there's an old saying, isn't there? You are what you eat. And that's no more true than Christians than anybody else. We are what we eat, and we eat the word. Man shall not live by bread alone, Jesus told the devil, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Why? Because that word is what gives us life. That's what gives us the quality of life. Food keeps the body going, great. But the word keeps the soul alive and tuned in to God, from whom we derive the grace and the help that we need in our times of need. We need both the many things of food, yes, but especially also the one thing needed, the good of bread portion, best portion, which is the bread of listening to God, speaking to us through his word and giving us food for our souls. We cannot neglect that, even if we do sometimes need to neglect food. So I think that's kind of what we find here. There are lots of little tensions here, a lot of little things here, but I think those are the understanding. This is the understanding that I think we should have of this passage. We're not contrasting service and prayer. We're not talking about different personalities here, but we're talking about what is a priority at certain times more than others, and certainly the need to spend time with God at some time during the day in order to reintegrate, if you like, our soul with his soul, to reconnect, to maintain that relationship that gives us such a blessing and is through us a blessing to others. Amen.